In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to create a database in the Android and then move that content from the polling of the database onto a list view. So we're going to query the database and take all that information and put it in the list view. So it's sort of picking up where the previous demo on database access left off. We've got an application here where we can add data to our database and I can clear it, but I've taken out all the other code that actually displays it for the moment. So if I look back at what my code's doing, well, let's start with the activity. I just have the add named button add, and then the clear named button clear. Both of those are calling into my callbacks on clear clear all and on click clear all and on click add record. So those are going into my activity. I've also got here my database adapter, which we did before, and importantly we've got a few of our rows. So we've got the primary key, or columns. So we got the primary key for the row ID. I then have the name, the student number, and favorite color. So that's what the database is storing. As shown down here, the row ID, the name, student number, and the favorite color. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this student number in this demo to be the resource ID of an image. So we're kind of going to abuse it this way. We don't have to write a lot of new code, but you can imagine in your application if you wanted images, you might be writing resource IDs, and then you'd have named it correctly. So what do I have in my code already? Well, of course I got my database adapter we saw last time, what we need that for. I have an onCreate method that opens my database. So here we have the down here, the open database. So it creates the adapter and then opens it. And then in my destroy, which is going to be called when the activity is destroyed, it calls close database here. I've got my two callbacks at the moment, which just insert a row into the database and then clear all. We can't actually see anything yet. So let's start by putting together the UI. It's always a great place to start. So here I'm going to put in a list view. So under composite here on the left, I'm going to drag in my list view. And I'll just slide that up so it takes up the full screen. And I'm going to give it a name. So let's give this list view info or items. No, let's call it list view from database. And rename that. And so that's all I really need for the moment. Now, if you look back at the other tutorial on how to create a list view, a complex list view, we saw that we also need to create our own XML file. Well, of course, the same thing applies here, so let's do that. So I'm going to go here under my resources, layout, right-click, new Android XML file. Select that. I'm now going to say that what do I want this to be called? Let's call this item layout for my list view, and I can pick any layout I like. I'm going to use the relative. It's easy to position things on the screen for that. So again, this comes up, it looks like it's going to be an activity. Of course it's not. It's going to be used to compress things. So let's just start tossing in the things we're going to need. So I'm going to want an image here. This time I'm going to put the image right in the middle. Let's center it right at the top. It wants to give it some value to start with, so I'm going to actually give it the icon there. It's the only icon we've got available. I'm going to put in a few more things. We need to have a field for the name. Let's make the name really large. I'll put it here top left. And I'm going to give it here item underscore name. Give it that the ID. Let's change the icon to be item underscore icon. And I'm going to put in a couple other things. We've got some color, the favorite user's favorite color, so I'll put that in here on the left. Item fav color. And the one last thing we have is we have the user's student number. So let's put that in as a small piece of text, and let's put it down bottom right. Item student num. So that's a good start. I'm going to tell this to resize because I'm going to bring in some big images. So I'm going to say resize, and we're going to want this to be, let's make it 80 dp for the width, 80 dp for the height. And let's just make sure that that actually took. So I'm going to resize, adjust the view, and max width and max height. Now it's not going to resize smaller ones, it's just the max, and I'm bringing in large ones, so that's not going to be a problem. So this is sort of the layout I'm going to use. We now need to get that onto the screen. And we saw last time we're going to use an adapter to do that. So before we actually do that, let's do one more thing, and I'm going to bring in some images that we're going to start to play with. So just sort of populating all the resources. So I'm going to bring it in under here, under the high DPI. And it's the same images I've worked with before. So dragging them from the Explorer, and I'm just going to drop them in here. I'm going to copy them. I want real copies. I don't want to link to somewhere else. And so now I've got all my images back in here. And they're, of course, pretty big, so that's why I needed this max layout size. Okay, now I've got the items there. Let's check out how do we actually add items to our database. Again, this is all going to be running through the database, so that's my model where I'm getting the information. Well, at the moment I'm adding information here, so every time I click Add Row, it adds the identical row. We have a user named, or person named Jenny, student number 12345, and the color green, his favorite color. So I said I'm going to exploit this student number, and I'm actually going to make it a resource ID of an icon. Now, there's a number of ways I could do this. I could do this in a bit of a hack. So I could go up here to Gen, the Gen folder. I could look at my R file. I could figure out what is my first one, this one here. And we notice that they're incremented sequentially here. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, all in hex values. That's fine. I could do that. So I could simply take bug and then add to it. But that's quite a hack, because we don't maybe want to show the launcher icon in here. And what if one of these got renumbered? We don't want to break because of that. That would be a very brittle way to do it. So I don't want to hard code anything on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array. So let's make it an integer array, because these are all integers. And I'm going to call this icon image IDs. So it's going to be an array of integers, and it's going to be the IDs as pulled from the R file. Now I don't want to hard code to that. I'm going to actually use the named constants that it's giving me. So I'm going to make this an array. Oops, they're already completed for me. And I'm going to pass in a bunch of these things. So r.drawable dot, and here we've got all the different ones. So I'm just going to start going through them. We want the bug, and I'm just going to go Control Alt down, and I'm going to duplicate this a bunch of times. So instead of bug, the next one is down, fish, heart, and so forth. We can see that I'm just going to grab all the icons here. I'm doing Control Space to bring up the context list. So I'm just creating an array of all the different icon IDs that I have available to me for when I actually start to use them on my screen. Star and up's the last one. Okay. So now I've got these that I can begin to use. A great thing to know is I'm going to sort of just want to walk through and give new IDs all the time. So let's create a counter for that. And let's call it next image index. So I'm going to count the index, and I'm going to start at 0. So this is effectively going to tell me which of these icons I want my next entry to have. So down here, when I actually go to add a new element, so down here when I add, let's actually figure out what number I want that to be. So I'm going to create a number here, int, and let's call this the image ID equals, well, I can look it up. I've got this array, so that's going to be my image IDs. And I know what image index it is, so next image index. Now, of course, every time it's going to give me the same value, so I'm going to count that up. So next image index equals, and we can do it this way, next image index plus 1. Of course, I don't want to count forever. I want to loop around based on the size of my array. So image IDs dot length. And so it's going to force it to wrap around. So all this is doing is giving me back a new image ID every time I come through this. So it's going to make our UI look nicer. Now the other thing I need to do is actually use this value. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm going to set this to be the image ID. Now, of course, we don't yet have any, we're not working with the database in any interesting way. So even if I put a bunch of this information in there, I'm not yet doing anything nice with it. So let's carry on and figure out what we can do next. Well, what I want to do really is I want to populate that list view. Remember back here on our UI, I've got this list view named list view for database, and I'm not doing anything with it yet. So let's create a new function up here, and when I create my database, after I've opened the database, let's populate it. So I'm going to populate list view from database. You might come up with a shorter name, but this is at least as explicit in terms of what we're going to do. So that was Control 1. I'm going to let Eclipse to generate the implementation for me. Oops, don't want to move. I want to move, not copy. And I'm going to move this all the way down to the bottom because it's something we're going to sort of call as part of our routines. So in here, we want to query the database. Well, we saw how to do that before in a previous tutorial. Just pull up my sample routine to make sure I code it right the first time. So we're going to want to query the database to find out what we want. So to do that, we can use a cursor. I'm going to call it cursor equals, and I believe here it's my DB, my database, dot, and I've got all these query things. I can do get, and I'm going to get all rows. So this gives me all the rows from the database back into cursor. Of course, it doesn't know what a cursor is. I'll go Control-Shift-O and automatically fix the imports. So now we know what the cursor is. And then I'm going to start to put this into the UI. Now I've got my cursor to work with, so that's where I'm getting the data from. And if you remember from before, what I wanted to do is I wanted to call setAdapter on my list view. So let's write that now. So I'm going to set the adapter for the list view. So this is going to be my list view. I got to find it first. My list equals cast find view by ID. This is going to be r.id dot, and this was list view for database. And I'm going to say my list dot set adapter. Where did that come up? Oh, doesn't know what it is yet. Control all the. There we go. Set adapter. And I need to pass in an adapter. So it turns out we're going to create what's called a cursor adapter. So I'm going to call it my cursor adapter. So this is sort of where we want to go. This is the last thing we're going to write. Now, what is this? Well, a cursor adapter is effectively what's going to take my cursor and it's going to adapt it to stuff it into this views. Now, the whole purpose of the adapter, we need to create an adapter here to map columns of the database onto elements in the UI. So this is going to be what's known as a simple cursor adapter. So it's a cursor adapter in the sense it's working from the database cursor. And let's call it my cursor adapter equals, and I'm going to go down to the next line so it all fits on my screen here, new simple cursor adapter. Now there's a number of constructors for this cursor adapter, and I will say right here that we're going to be using some deprecated functionality. This isn't usually a good idea, but as it turns out, they deprecated this functionality for a reason we'll talk about in a moment, but they didn't reintroduce any extra functionality that allows us to do the same thing easily. There's ways to do it, but it's rather complicated. So for some very simplistic applications, this way is going to be fine. So what I now need to do is I need to pass in a bunch of arguments to my constructor here. And so we're going to be using one of these down here that's been deprecated. And we need to pass in a bunch of mappings. So we'll leave that for the moment. But what do we really want to do? Well, if you think about the cursor, this cursor is going to be giving me some information. The name, the student number, the favorite color. And I need to map that to elements in my UI. So I need to basically kind of set up this mapping. Now, the way that we do this is we're going to set up mapping from cursor to view fields. We're going to do this through mapping the string of the database name, the column name, to an ID in the view. So let's actually do that. Maybe it'll make sense that way. So I need a string array, and we're going to call this from field names, new string array, and I can actually here provide it a list of them that I want. Now, this is going to be my first part. I'm going to create a second part of the mapping, which is going to be a parallel array. So int, an integer, and it's going to be two view IDs equals a, I'm going to say new int array, and I can populate it here with some values. So what's going to happen is I'm going to list something here. So for example, let's start with a name. So the database adapter, database adapter, which is my database class that I've used before. I'm going to find the key that I want, and let's go with the key for the name. So we have all the keys for the names here set up. So the key for the name, and then what do I want to actually stick it into? Well, if I go to r.id. What am I going to put here? Let's look. So I want this to be the name. We change the text here. Name. That's where we want the name to go. So it's going to be named item underscore name. So go back in here, and this is going to be item underscore, there we have it, item underscore name. So this is very simple to start with. Take the database field named key name. That's going to be a constant. I'm going to control click on it, and it's going to take me in here, and it says, well, this is stored as the column named name. And you see here that you have the student number, the favorite number. We're going to use that. That's what's coming from the database, and it's going to map to this point in the UI. So let's finish this piece of code here to actually complete the mapping. I need to give it some context. So this, I'm going to put in here, this is the context for the system to work. I need to tell it what layout it wants to target. So r.layout, layout dot, and the layout I want is that item layout that we were working with a moment ago. So this is the row layout template. Next, I need to give it the cursor. I named my cursor cursor. And then I need to tell it how the mapping is going to work. So the from fields, and then the to fields. So this is the view IDs to put information in, and this is going to be the database column names, or the values in the database. And the cursor here is just the set of database records. In this case, it happens to be all of them. It doesn't have to be, though. Okay, so let's see here. We probably haven't imported this yet, so Control-Shift-O, and I'm going to import the Android widget, simple widget. And we can see here it's got this crossed out. That's Eclipse's way of telling us this has been deprecated, as we have this comment as well. When I save the file, we see we get a warning on the left. Again, this is just a way that's going to work. It's not great. Now, there's one more thing here to realize. When we run this, where do we close the cursor? Remember, every time you've got a database cursor, you need to close it somewhere. So where do I do that? Well, I could close it down here, for example, except the problem is that if I close the cursor, it throws away the record set. But the UI may need that record set later on. For example, if I scroll the list, we come back and it needs to refresh the screen. So I can't really close the cursor. I don't want to leave it open either, otherwise I'm going to get a memory leak. Now, it turns out there's a solution for this. We can let the activity manage when to close it. So right under here, I'm going to say allow activity to manage lifetime of the cursor. Now, this is deprecated. And in fact, we'll see what it's going to do, and later I'll come back and explain what's going on here. So it's called Start Managing Cursor. And I pass it in a cursor. And when I save this, it's going to come up being deprecated as well. But that's just a known feature that we're going to live with for the moment. So what's going on? I get the data, that the record set that I want to display in the form of a cursor. I tell the activity to start managing its lifetime. I set up this mapping of information, and then I create a cursor to do the actual creation of the rows, the views for the rows. And then finally, I set the cursor or the adapter down here on my list view. So I'm going to run that with Control F11, pardon me, and hopefully that's going to launch here in my emulator. Now, when it comes up, we're going to get a lot of garbage things in here because we had some garbage in the database. Oh, here, I'll clear that. And when I click Add, we're not getting anything. So let's try and figure out why we're not getting any data. First, we see that we're not having any crashes, but that's good. We have here the Populate ListView from database. And where is that being called? Well, that's being called after we open the database. So on create, we open the database, and then we change things. Now note, we're not actually redrawing the, let's find it down here. Whenever I insert a row into the database, I'm not redrawing my UI. So for example, if I close this and relaunch the application, the database is going to be persistent, and so the data comes up here. But we're not redrawing it, we're not refreshing it. So I need to call this refresh function. I need to repopulate the list view every time we finish changing the database. So do it here, as well as when we clear. Control F11, relaunch. And now when it comes up, we should see this text being updated. Remember, all we're displaying at the moment is the text. That's the only thing we've set up in our cursor. So I'll clear that. And now as I add, we add more things. Now, of course, everything we're stuffing into the database happens to be named Jenny. Let's fix that. Let's add some variety to our lives. So up here, when I created the database row on Insert Row, I'm just going to concatenate in here. Let's concatenate the number, the image index, the next one, sure. We just want to differentiate them somehow. So this won't actually refer to the same image we're on. It'll refer to the next one, but that's fine. It'll just be different names every time. And then we'll be able to see that we actually are working with the different data. I'll clear all the existing data, and then as I add this, we see here we're actually getting the numbers, and as I add a bunch more, I'll be able to scroll the list, and we can see that the numbers wrap around just as we wanted. I've got 8 images in my array. So why am I not getting the rest of this populated? This is just the standard text and the icon we selected at compile time. So why is it not getting me the right information? Well, if we come back to our populate list, we see that we only said to map this one column to this one value, to this one image resource in my UI. So let's go for another one. Let's map the icon. Now, as it turns out, if it's a image box and you pass it an integer, it's smart enough to think that that's a resource. And so this works quite nicely. You may, I think, I recall, have to be on Android 2.2 or higher, perhaps, or 2.3. I'm demoing this on Android 2.3.3. I recall in some of the really older versions, perhaps 2.1, this isn't going to work. So db adapter dot which key I want? Well, I want the key for the student number. Remember, I'm kind of overloading this. I'm abusing it, if you will. That's one, and I'm going to space this out just so we have this line up nice. r.id, and I want to now put it into the item, and this is going to be the icon. So let's rerun that and prove it's going to work. So now we should get a lot of nice, cool icons here instead of those the Android icon that we have. And there we have it. The icon's populated from the database. So let's complete this by adding in, instead of medium text, we want to display the color, and instead of text view down here, we want this to say the student number. So I'm going to do here the adapter, database adapter dot key, and let's go for the favorite color, maps to, again I'll space it out just so it looks good, r.id dot item, and this is going to be the favorite color. And then finally I'm going to do the db adapter dot key, again going back to the student number, and we're going to put that into r.id dot item and the student number displayed. Now you'll note that I am pulling the student number out twice. That's simply because we're overloading it and using it for two things. In a real application, we'd have our own fields in the database that are well named. So now when I run this, it should come up and populate all the fields for me. While this is doing it, I'll explain what this whole deprecated reason is for. It turns out that this cursor that we're using to display our list view is running on the UI thread. Note here we've got it fully populated. So what happens is, while we query the database, the UI thread locks up. And so if you have a very large query, for example a huge database, that query could take a long time. Your UI will look unresponsive during that time, and Android may even in fact kill your application because it thought it was unresponsive. So the guys at Android have designed it a new way on how to do that using a background thread and asynchronous task, but it turns out you got to do a lot of the work yourself. So by doing this start managing cursor and using the simple cursor on the UI thread, that's good enough for us. For small queries, little pieces of information. So deprecated, this runs on the UI thread. It's okay for small, short queries. It's quick, it's easy, and it's not the best idea, but at least it's easy to implement and get working. Okay, so now we've got it displaying. Let's make it so that you can actually click on something. So again, up here I'm going to actually register a callback like we've done before with other list views. So I'm going to register list click callback, sure. Create the method. I'm going to cut this and go all the way down to the bottom, so after my populate, and I'm going to put it into here. So what I want to do here is I want to find the list view that I'm working with. Well, I happen to have done that up here with my list view. So I'll just copy this. So that gives me my list view I'm working with. And then on this list view, so my list, I'm going to set an on-item click listener, not just an on-click listener. So I want this to be a new, and it comes from the, I believe, the adapter view. Dot, and here are the different the things we want, and we want the on-item click listener. Save that, and now it's going to want to import this, and then it's going to tell us that we've got unimplemented fields. So I go Control-1 on it and add the unimplemented fields. Eclipse gives me the template for that already. So there we go. So coming into here, I've got a lot of information. Again, it's unnamed, so we happen to know this is going to be the parent. The view is the view clicked. These are clicked on. Let me just reorder this slightly, put it down on the right line. And I'm going to make this the position. And finally, we have the ID that we're working with. So let's start by putting out a, I could put out a log message, or I could do a few other things. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to display a toast. And let's actually write it in here. So I've got the ID already. So I'm going to want to get a set of information for this. How do I pull this from the database? This ID happens to be the ID for the database. So let's actually rename that. ID in database. So I'm going to use a cursor. Let's call it cursor equals the my database. I'm going to query and get a single row, not all rows this time. I need an ID, so this is the ID in database. And now I get back my cursor. So I'm going to, well, first I'm going to write the code to close it. So cursor.close. Go up, and then process it. So remember before we wanted to process it, so we reset it to the first. If cursor.move to first, if that succeeded, we're actually active and have a valid cursor. And then I'm going to extract some information. So I've got the this is the ID from the database. It is going to be the cursor dot get a long. And now you need to give it the column, so database adapter, so my adapter code, get the column, and this is going to be the column for the row ID. So that's one piece of information, getting it from the record. I'm going to duplicate this a few times, and we're going to want to get a string for the name. I'm going to want to get a integer for the student number, and I'm going to get a string for the favorite color. Okay, other things I want to do is instead of getting a long, I want to get a string. This is a integer, and let me fix that, int, and a string. And then I need to fix the column IDs. So here, instead of it being the row column ID, I'm going to control space. This is for the name. The student number is student number, and the favorite color is favorite color at the top. Good, so now I'm extracting the information. Let's create a string. So let's call it message equals ID. I'm going to concatenate that with the ID from the database. Oops. And I'm going to put this actually on separate lines using the /n. And then down here we've got the ID, so then we get to get the name. And then let's do the student number. And finally, we got the favorite color. And then I'm going to display a toast. I can type out the toast again. I just happen to have a version of the toast ready in a copy and paste buffer. And so I want to fix this to be the message that I'm using. And let's put it up for a toast length. Let's make it long for the moment. Import, fix the imports, and we're good to go. So now whenever I click on an item, it's going to run this callback in here. This anonymous class gets executed, calling in my onItemClick method. And I create a cursor, so I query the database for the values I want. I move to the first element, and then I pull out the data and use the data. So let's run that and see if it works. So let's click on here, Jenny2. When I click on it, it pops up a toast for Jenny2, and ID is 47. So it was Jenny2. If I click on the next one, ID is 48. If I click on the first one, the ID was 46. So in fact, what's going on here is the ID that I'm pulling out here is going to be exactly the same number as I had here. How do I know that? Well, I'm querying the database by that. So I'm getting a single row at a time. Okay, so that's allowing me to register for a click. Let's try and update the database. So whenever you click on a row, so for example, when I click on this one, what I want to do is I want to change the favorite color. Let's just add exclamation marks after it. So that'll allow me to just show that I can update the database in response to a user event. So I'm going to, well, I could add it in here, but this is starting to get a little cumbersome. So I'm going to extract a method. I'm going to select this code. It all does one thing. What does this do? This displays a toast for an ID. So I'm going to go Alt-Shift-M to extract, and I'm going to call this display toast for ID. Hit enter. It auto extracts it here. Now put it inside of my inner class. I don't want it there. I want it inside my main class. So I'm going to Alt down until it's in the outer class. And the inner class is quite happy to call the outer class. So that's great. Now let's create another method here just to keep it simple. Let's call it update item for ID. And let's give it the ID in database. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it ahead of my display. So I'm going to update first and then display it. Control-1, create the method. Creates the signature here, or the basics of it. I'm going to move that down to below. We're calling it before, so I'm going to put it in here. So now I need to update my item. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to go through the cursor again. So I'm going to, in fact, copy all of this code, and then we'll change it as we need it. So I'm going to query the row. If I have data, I'm going to pull out all that data. And then I can do something with it. I don't want to build a string, so I'm going to get rid of this. Don't want a string, don't want to put up a toast message. I'm going to write the data back into the database. So let's actually change the string here. So I'm going to change fave color. I'm just going to concatenate plus equal a single exclamation mark to it. I can do any change I want. I could switch to a new image. I could switch the name. This at least is going to be enough. And then I'm going to call my database.update. And then I can basically construct the information. The most important thing to get right is this row ID that identifies the specific row I want to update. So that's the ID in database. And then I go through and update it. So here we have the name, the student number. We got all the names right, actually. So we're going to just populate all of these fields back in. So remember this function, update rows. I'll go to it, Control-click. It's expecting a bunch of information. It's going to take that information, and it's going to build an SQL query, and then execute that SQL query on the database. So down here, we're actually going to execute that query. So here, I'm just passing in the information. I'm going to let it do all the hard work with the database. Now, the one thing I want to do is, after I've done all of this, I need to update the screen. So I'm going to populate the list view again. Because I've just changed it, I want it to refresh. So I'm going to call that every time I want it to refresh. So now let's run this and see what happens when I click on an element. So let's take Jenny3. I'll click on it once. We get the exclamation mark, and we query the database. Do it again. We're going to keep concatenating the exclamation marks onto it. If I go down here, I'll scroll down to the bottom. We've got quite a few all here. Let's go all the way down to the bottom one. When I click on it, note that it updated, but it also scrolled the list back to the top because I called Populate the list based on the database, so it repopulates that. If I wanted it to maintain the scroll position, I'd have to write some extra code to do that. We're not going to bother with that now, but that's another thing you might want to consider if you're redrawing the UI to not lose the user's place. Imagine this was a very long list. It'd get very frustrating having to scroll through all the time. Okay, so that concludes what we're going to cover in this demo. What have we seen? Well, we saw first we added a list view to the UI, and then we created our layout, just like we do for the normal list views. We had in the background already a database adapter that we could use, fully configured from the previous tutorial. Inside of my code, I went through the process of first setting up the IDs in sort of an array that I could then use to generate different icons on the screen. I populated the list view. Was probably the biggest innovation we had, which was creating a cursor to actually populate or to get the data. I let the activity manage it. Again, deprecated, but it's okay for us. And then down here, I set up the mapping of database fields to user interface fields or interface locations, views that I want to populate. I then use a simple cursor adapter to actually manage the creation and the population of that user interface. And then I tell the list that I want to actually use that. For register on click listener, click callback, we have the set on item click, and then I called a couple functions to actually display and change the database. And so here we saw we actually called the update row function so we can change elements in the database. Alright, well, thank you for watching.